All right, so we're going to talk about the blueprint and hopefully then get into vocabulary instruction. All right. So as you take a look at the blueprint, I want you to keep this in mind. I'll probably say it over and over and over again. It is not a lesson plan. It's a master plan. It is meant to help you organize up. When you come to text, whether you're reading a chapter book, whether you're reading an informational passage, you need to be thinking about these different contributors to comprehension. You can't necessarily address all of them all of the time, but you need to be thinking about what is that text demanding, all right? So, on the left-hand side, what you see are the components of the blueprint. And so we begin by talking about critical understandings of text. That's the big picture. That's what you want your student to take away from, whether it's a chapter book, whether it's a novel, whether it's a textbook, whether it's an informational passage. What do you want them to take away? What's the big idea? Right? Purpose for reading text, we always set purpose each and every day. Then we start to think about the actual reading of the text, the vocabulary, the language structures. Notice these are the processes that I talked with you about that come from the reading rope and come from Kate Kane's work. On the right-hand side are the questions that you need to be asking yourself as you prepare for instruction. And the questions reflect what the evidence tells us about those language processes. Why are they important? What do they look like? How do we define them? And then how do we teach our students how to work with and develop those processes and skills? Notice there's a bidirectional arrow. The bidirectional arrow says before, during, and after. Remember I said this flexibility? You make the decision when you do the instruction. Some instruction has to be done before. Some you're doing during. Some you're doing after. You make the decision. There's flexibility here. You're making the decision whether or not your students are in whole group, in smaller group for intervention, or in very small or individually for intensive. The other part of the arrow is comprehension monitoring. You want your students monitoring their comprehension throughout. Did I understand that word? Does that sentence make sense? Do I know what the author meant here? Why did he use that little word instead of saying Benjamin Banneker again? What background knowledge do I need to surface? What the heck is a revolutionary? Okay? So, comprehension monitoring and teaching your students, your kiddos, how to address when there are glitches in their understanding, and you do that throughout. Okay. So I'm going to start at the beginning here, and we'll work our way through as best we can with the time that we have today. Right. And I'm going to start with that very first question. What do you want your students to know and understand after reading the text? What are the critical concepts and understandings, big ideas you want your students to acquire? You should always have an answer to that question. It should not be, I want them to be able to tell me the main idea and details. That's not the answer to that question. It might be the answer to another question. All right? So main idea and details is a skill. It's a product, actually. All right? It's a product. Here, we're talking about that big overall understanding that we want our students to have. So when we get ready to teach a text, all of you, when you get ready to teach a text, you prepare the text, right? You read the text. Don't depend upon the program developers. They'll give you some good direction. Your basal series will give you good direction, but you need to read the text, whatever it happens to be, and be reflective in terms of what it demands of your students, right? So you want to identify the deep knowledge base, the critical understandings, and then, by the way, if you have the choice, you want to identify readings, right, that will support the development of the knowledge base and that academic language piece I was talking about before. So some of you have choice in terms of what you read aloud to students or what readings you're actually doing, or some of you may be involved in curriculum development, right? Or sometimes you can supplement what it is that your curriculum has provided. Okay. So what are critical understandings? Okay. Well, it's a synthesis of what individuals should understand, not just know or do. It's an essential knowledge base. You develop it both across and within grade levels, and they're critical concepts that we want our students to have. You may be doing this in your English language arts classes, in your Tier 2, your Tier 3, but you also should be thinking about this if you're teaching content areas, right? Here's what Wiggins and McTeague, some of you know Understanding by Design. Anybody in the room? Yep, okay. Here's what they say about enduring understandings. Just take a moment and read it to yourself. So I love that last question. Enduring understandings are all about giving students a reason for reading, a reason for learning. Why does it matter? Now, I thought you might like a sample of how teachers sometimes arrive at critical or enduring understanding. So this is an example from Julia Salomon, a colleague of mine at AIM Academy. It's a private school. I've worked quite a bit with them on curriculum development. And we had the opportunity, grade by grade, to think about what are the critical topics, critical understandings that we want our students to have, right, as they engage in reading text. Now, certainly they're teaching their students how to decode and work with word recognition, but we're talking about now making meaning, right? So what might we think about? And in developing these critical topics, that's what you see there, it's a critical topic, revolutionaries, right? They looked at, well, what are they learning in history? What are they learning in science? Are there some math concepts that we could connect? So some of you are probably familiar with interdisciplinary teaching. Sort of sounds a little bit like that, doesn't it? Probably sounds a little bit like theme-centered teaching as well. Yeah? Okay. And they came up with a list of things that they thought they might use as their enduring understandings or critical understandings, right? And so working together across, this was 4th grade, I think, they came up with this list. The one they settled on is this. We can learn life lessons from revolutionaries. Well, once they did that, all right, critical topic, revolutionaries, critical understanding, they had to think about the text they were going to use. So they had to look at, well, what were their standards calling for? What was typically being used across the grade level? Because they were going to use age and grade appropriate text, even though their students had word recognition issues. We're continuing to work at that. And one of the texts they identified is in the upper right-hand corner, and you've already heard me reference dear Benjamin Banneker, who was an activist or a revolutionary. So going along with this, they began to consider, well, along with Benjamin Banneker, which they were familiar with, what was some of those other texts that they might be able to use? So again, you could be asking yourself, what are you currently reading to your students? What is your curriculum demanding? What might you supplement with? What text would convey, because knowledge grows over time, it's not a one-shot deal, right? To have deep knowledge, you have to keep at it bit by bit. What other ways could they convey this idea? So they asked themselves, what readings reflect this knowledge base, the critical understandings, that whole thing about revolutionaries? But they also asked themselves, will the reading opportunities provide opportunities to address language needs and academic demands? Because they were very cognizant of the fact they wanted to develop their students' language. And do the readings represent different genre? Disciplines, an integrated approach. Look, it's great to read narrative to kids. They love narrative. They know stories. They know stories when they come to school. So narratives are pretty easy initially for kids. But you can't just read narratives to them. You also have to read informational text so that they build content or domain-specific knowledge. So they thought quite a bit about that, all right? Now, academic language is, I gave you a hint earlier, just so this is a little bit of a lexicon check again, all right? Ready? It's the language of higher education. It's the language of everyday conversation. It's the language needed by students to do the work in schools. Everyone think about what you think the answer is here. Here we go. Not that. Not that. Oh, bingo, it's that. Okay. All right. So finding the right text, making certain that the text contain academic language, this kind of more sophisticated language of school. So lots of things to think about in choosing purposeful text. Not just does it convey the knowledge base, but are we also going to give them opportunity to read different types of texts, listen to different types of texts, and develop language? Now, what's the rationale for thinking about, because I keep saying age and grade appropriate text, and you're probably thinking, what is this woman crazy? Some of our kids can't read the words. Well, I'm not alone in thinking this. So here's Marilyn Adams. She's talking about beginning readers, right? Take a moment and read what she says about beginning readers. Okay, so she's really conveying to us, yeah, use those decodable texts. Get your kids reading. But don't forget about the fact that you have to develop language knowledge. And then she says, you know, giving children easier texts to read when they're weaker readers, what happens with that? It denies them these opportunities to develop the language and information that they need to catch up on and move on. And I don't know about some of you, but I can remember working with middle school boys, actually. I was a special ed teacher in middle school for a while in my life. And one of the things that I made a big mistake with was I read to them the dumbed-down versions of the novels that the kids were reading in 7th and 8th grade. Big mistake, because I was denying them that language. And then they didn't have access to it when they went to high school. And they were smart kids, right? They deserved to have access to that language. Shanahan also, some of you know the work of Tim Shanahan, he says we shouldn't deny kids these texts that appear to be really difficult for them. What struggling students need is guidance from a teacher in how to make sense of the text designed for kids at their respective grade levels. So there's lots of argument for, okay, choosing purposeful texts, aligned with critical understandings, academic language, age and grade appropriate. But you have to scaffold. And when I keep talking to you about academic language, what am I meaning? I'm meaning this, that the vocabulary is going to be semantically complex, abstract, nuanced, and technical. It is not going to be the language you hear every single day. That's not going to help your students. That's not the way that texts are written, right? Also, it's going to be language that's based in morphology. We all know this, right? So the language of upper grade text, once we want our students to move from, as Courtney said, learning to read and reading to learn, all right? Those words are going to be Latin-based, Greek-based, okay? The syntax is going to be grammatically complex. I've already touched upon that for you. We're going to have density, we're going to have embedded phrases and clauses, we're going to have nominalizations. Nouns become verbs, verbs become nouns. And the discourse structures are going to be complex and varied. So that very same group of teachers that I was talking about, keeping all this in mind, all right, using their decodable text for word recognition, said, okay, we're going to talk about these life lessons. We're going to be certain that the texts have age and grade appropriate language. We're going to develop that academic language, right? We're going to stay focused on what we want them to take away across discipline. And here are the books that they read to them or they read, right? And of course, this is a unit of instruction that I'm talking about. Now, you may not be working with units of instruction, but if you are, you can think about how can I enhance what I'm doing based on this? Giant Steps to Change the World, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Dolores Huerta, Georgia O'Keeffe, I Too Am America, Albert Einstein, and of course, Dear Benjamin Banneker. So giving our students in ELA classes access to, right, in their reading classes, access to texts that are very purposeful. So I wanted to give you an example of some of the language, right? So here's language from Dear Benjamin Banneker. There were many white scientists in Benjamin's day who taught themselves astronomy and published their own almanacs, but it didn't occur to them a black man, free or slave, could be smart enough to calculate the movements of the stars the way Benjamin did. Look at the vocabulary. What's the meaning of astronomy? What the heck is an almanac? Right. Calculate? Oh, like in math? And movements. Look at the sentence structure. Look at the first sentence, all right? who taught themselves astronomy and published their own almanacs. That's a relative clause, by the way. Now, your students don't need to know that, but they need to know that that relative clause is carrying meaning and referencing back to many white scientists, right? Second sentence begins with but. Oh, already we've got an adversative conjunction. They need to know the meaning of that little signal word, okay? So sophisticated language, all right? Now, for older students, I mentioned earlier, Lily, an incoming 9th grader, she's reading Animal Farm, also reading Stalin, A Brutal Legacy. It's a common lit excerpt. And she's also reading Animal Farm and In the Time of Butterflies. What's her big idea? What's her critical understanding? Democracy versus dictatorship. Yeah, that's the critical topic, and then there's some questions that go with it. All right, let's look at an excerpt from that in terms of the kind of language we're talking about developing. Take a moment and read that to yourself. How many sentences do you see?
One.
Yeah, thank you. That's one sentence. You want to talk about density of ideas and length? So by 8th grade, here's an expectation. Granted, for a bright kid, a kid who can handle, advanced language, but so can so many of our struggling readers, if in fact they have the opportunity to develop all along the way this kind of language. Do you notice the vocabulary words? Yeah. Well, we could start with steely. How about genocidal? Yeah. Now, if we had some morphology in play, we might understand that, okay? Searing. Okay. We could go to exile, expulsion, fomenting. All right. So thinking about text. So one, we identify critical understandings, and you have to work with what you have. I'm well aware of that. I mean, if you have an opportunity to change, that's fine. But if you have an opportunity to enhance, supplement, or choose, be thinking about texts that are based on critical understandings. We build this mental model over time. Texts that have academic language, and texts that cut across disciplines. That's the way we build a knowledge base for our students as they continue to work with whatever other challenges they might have. Okay. So here's a quick reflect for all of you, because I like teachers to be metacognitive, and I know they are. I bet there's not one of you, whether you're a classroom teacher, a tutor, a parent, hasn't had a plan for teaching a student, your student, someone else, something, worked through that plan and said to yourself, that really worked well, or that's gone right in the round file. I would never use that plan again, and this is the way I'll do it next time. I do that every time I do one of these workshops, right? So good teachers, informed teachers, are metacognitives. You're always asking yourself questions. So here's a few quick reflect questions. I think I put this in your participant guide, but we can just look at these together. Will these readings develop the identified critical understandings? See, we can't be willy-nilly about our choice of readings for our students. Right? Will these readings provide opportunities to develop necessary language processes and skills? Do these texts provide opportunity to develop academic language, not the language of everyday classrooms or everyday language? Our language, in fact, in the classroom should be academic language. And when our language is academic language, we hear that language in our students' conversations. Do these readings represent different genre, disciplines, an integrated approach to learning? And have we considered access for struggling readers? Well, I think I've said a lot about that today. Okay. So, connections, current practices, right? So what did we just talk about? I'm talking about getting ready, right? Prepping now for using the blueprint. And I've just addressed that first part, the critical understandings. And I said, coupled with that, you have to start thinking about the readings, right? So turn around to the person sitting behind you, right? So you turn around to her. And either singly, one-to-one, or in partners, because there's not an even match, just share one idea that you're walking away with from what I just shared with you. Turn around, turn around, turn around.
Kind of my idea about that is once you've done it, then you've done it. You've got that for the next. If you stay within a certain grade span, you keep building.
All right, if I can ask you to finish your sentence and swing back around, that would be great. Finish your sentences, your thoughts. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. Any questions or comments? Okay. Okay. All right. So just keep in mind, you do what you can within the setting that you're in. But you're all tempered radicals. That means you're advocates for doing what's right. And you do it in a way that's acceptable and gets heard. Okay? I'm on this bandwagon about all of us being tempered radicals for structured literacy, for effective instruction. But you do what you can within the setting that you're in. All right. So as we talk now about vocabulary instruction, I want to just remind you that our instructional routines, our strategies, our activities are going to be very focused on process so that our students can produce product. They will all be evidence-based. As I talk about strategies and activities, I can't talk about all of them, but I'm going to give you a sampling. Okay. I also want to remind you that, yes, I can talk about indirect, or what I call incidental on purpose opportunities for developing vocabulary, sentence comprehension, and so on, but our focus will be on explicit instruction, because that's what's most meaningful for all our students, particularly those who are struggling, right? So when we talk about explicit instruction, the words of Anita Archer, the queen of direct instruction, explicit instruction, we say that this will be structured. Wow, sounds like something I said earlier. It will be systematic, and it will be scaffolded. So structured literacy instruction in the area of comprehension, right, is structured. It's based on this blueprint. It's based on these language processes. It's based on the research, right? Remember I said you can do instruction before, during, and after, flexibility. Some things just call for it before instruction. And instruction can be delivered in whole, small, or individually. Okay, so here comes vocabulary instruction. So when we come to text, we have to work with word. Remember, Kay Kane said, you have to decode the words and access the meaning of the words. So here's what you need to ask yourself. And here's what we're going to answer. Which words? Which words will your students need to know or worth knowing? You cannot teach all of the words that are going to be in the text. Some of them you'll have to do incidentally on purpose. But we're going to focus on explicit instruction. So start with, which words will I intentionally teach? All right, how will I intentionally target and directly teach those words? Which ones will I incidentally on purpose teach? How and when? Which words will you purposefully discuss, incorporate into expressive language activities? Your kiddos have to use those words. It's not enough to give them a definition or a context or even put it into a journal. They have to use the words, either orally or in their writing. Right? How and when will you teach and foster the use of independent word learning strategies? I'll briefly talk about that. You can't teach all of the words, so you have to give your kids some strategies for figuring out words when they're reading. Dictionary, morphology, and context. Those are independent word learning strategies. You're not always with them, neither are their parents. Okay. And is there figurative language that requires explanation? All right, let's see what we're going to say about this. So vocabulary, remember it's one of the strands, so I didn't just pull this out of the air, never mind all the research that's been done by many, many individuals in this particular area. And here's some rationale. Here's some connections. Because again, when someone says, why are you spending time on that? You can say, vocabulary is important for both word recognition and comprehension, right? It facilitates the reading of a word, we know that. It depends on accessible, well-specified, and flexible knowledge of word forms and meaning. That's Chuck Perfetti's work. Boy, you got to store this word in a lot of different ways. It's not a single definition here. Words are multidimensional. You know, if you really know a word, you know a whole lot about the word. You can tell me the part of speech, You can tell me derivatives, you can tell me connotation, I mean, you can tell me all sorts of things. And children, here's the home run, with better vocabulary knowledge have higher reading comprehension scores. Oh, that's the product part, right? Concurrently and longitudinally. Okay. So my teacher said school has tough new standards and I need to improve my vocabulary. What's vocabulary? What's vocabulary? Okay, so start thinking a little bit about what you think vocabulary is. Let's see if it aligns with, I say it's your mental dictionary, not I. Everyone who writes about this says it's your mental dictionary. So it's your mental dictionary of word meanings. But word meanings for what purposes? Well, for listening. Right now you're using your word meanings, right, as I'm speaking to you. I'm not speaking gibberish because you understand English language and you understand the meaning of the words I'm using. At least 99% of the mental model might have thrown you a little bit. Okay. So we've got listening vocabulary, we have speaking vocabulary. And I'm definitely speaking to you, I think I am, I'm saying definitely, but I think I'm speaking to you in academic language today. I'm not having like my one-to-one normal conversation or cell phone conversation with you, because I'm using the language that's specific to this discipline. Okay, speaking vocabulary. You have to have a depth of knowledge to use words expressively. Okay. We've got writing vocabulary. Oh, don't you want your kids writing precisely? Using wonderful words, expressive words. All right, that's a depth of knowledge as well. And then reading vocabulary. So vocabulary has some different facets. Some words we know extremely well, we own them. Some words we just recognize they hang out in our neighborhood. And some words we don't know at all. Okay, so a little bit of background knowledge, a little bit more. You can tell I'm big on the background knowledge. So here's some different ways of thinking about vocabulary in addition to the mental dictionary. That's the first definition. Look at the second one. Sometimes when I say to educators, think about what you think vocabulary is, that's what pops into your head. Oh, it's a component of instruction. Oh, the National Reading Panel told me I have to teach that. I have to teach vocabulary. But sometimes this last one pops into your head, and I'm hoping this does. The kind of words that students must know to read increasingly complex texts. In other words, academic language. So if your students have a base knowledge of words, then you build on that, and your vocabulary words that you choose, right, are going to be based on the fact that they're more mature, they're more sophisticated, and so on. Okay. Now here's the other thing about learning word meaning that you have to have in the back of your mind when you're doing this. This is the evidence, by the way. I'm big on evidence, right? Okay, and this is I have Nagy and Scott quoted here, but you know, if you read the texts or the research articles on vocabulary, you're going to see that they reference at different points in time the fact that vocabulary is incremental. You learn it bit by bit. Your understanding, for instance, of mental model, maybe you've never heard that phrase before. And maybe you'll continue to hear it, and bit by bit you'll understand it more and more. Or maybe there's a word in your own reading that you come across, and you say, wow, let me go look up the meaning of that word, and then all of a sudden it seems to pop up everywhere, right? Bit by bit, incremental. So we learn words bit by bit. Little guys and gals, all right, fast map words. You know, when there are 2 or 3, they say everything they hear. All right, and whether they keep those words is dependent upon their experiences with those words. That's the slow mapping part. All right, if you want kids to really own words, you have to slow map them. You have to give them lots and lots of examples and opportunities so that they realize that words are interrelated, they're part of a network. Remember, your vocabulary connects to your background knowledge. So they're part of this network, semantic network, related words. And they're also multidimensional. So you know the part of speech, you know if there's morphemes, you know the connotation, you know the denotation, and so on. Okay. So you need to know this about word learning when you start thinking about instruction. So if you're having your kids, or you know anyone who's having their kids say, oh, I do vocabulary instruction, I have them keep a word journal, and they look up the word and they write a sentence. That's not vocabulary instruction. That will lead to ownership of word, because it needs to align with these principles, okay? So I keep talking about levels of understanding, okay? So here's a quick check for you, all right? And I'm going to send you to your participant guide in a minute for an activity. And I want you to think about this, all right? In the context of vocabulary learning, all right? The word breadth, depth, and I used fluency. In the context of vocabulary learning, all right? What's your level of understanding? All right? If you've never met either one of those words, or any one of the three, I should say, in the context of vocabulary learning, you'd probably put a little check in the box under never met. But if you have met the word, it hangs out in your neighborhood, you recognize it, you probably can talk a little bit about it, you could put the check there, right? However, if that word is your BFF, and you can tell me everything about it in terms of vocabulary learning, then you could put the check there. So you can kind of mentally do the check off, right? In terms of breadth, depth, and fluency. Now go do the quick read in your facilitator's guide about what these words mean. All right? So when we talk about breadth, right? Students usually develop a breadth of word knowledge, word meaning, through varied encounters either orally or during reading, right? They recognize words. Sometimes they can use the context to figure out the word. Sort of like how many words, are up here circulating around in networks, all right, that I have a sense of what that word means. It's probably not a word that I use expressively in my language, right? Because I don't have a depth, I don't own that word yet. I may eventually own it, right? But I don't yet. Depth, though, means I know everything about this word and I continue to get the nuance of the word. And I can use this word both orally and in my writing. And the reality is, if you want students to be able to easily access words, to be fluent in terms of word meaning, they have to have a depth of knowledge. They have to have extended semantic networks that they can tap into in order to understand the use of the word and then their ability to use the word, right? As educators, because there's a limited number of words that we can directly teach from text, we usually go for depth. And that means it's going to be more than just a definition and a context. It's going to be a limited number of words because we're going to depend upon their other experiences to develop that breadth. And hopefully, incrementally, bit by bit, maybe they have those words at a deeper level. So learning word meaning, all right, incremental, interrelated, and multidimensional. And when students really acquire words at a depth of knowledge, it's because they've had all of these varied experiences or opportunities for direct, explicit instruction and then multiple activities that engage them, right? So when I talk about dimensions of depth, I'm talking about, wow, if I really know a word, what do I know about it? Well, I know about the phonology and the morphology. And in fact, when I'm teaching this to my students, I probably should be asking them about the phonology and morphology of the word. Here come those language systems again. And I know how to spell the word. That's a part of my understanding of this word. It's a part of the network. And I have a meaning that I can express in my own words, not dictionary-ese, all right, but my own words. And then I probably know something about the semantic category for the word. I probably know the connotation of the word. I probably have the syntactic category in mind, and even figurative use. So think about that word activist or revolutionary and all the ways that I might want my students who are reading Benjamin Banneker to understand that word. I would want them to know, oh, activist. Oh, well, there are 3 syllables. Yeah. And I think active is probably the base word, and ist, oh, that's a suffix, and that means one who. That's going to contribute to the meaning. And then I'm going to have some kind of a definition that I've learned over time that I can express in my own words. Oh, that's somebody who really gets involved, right? Who's really active, who advocates, who sometimes is revolutionary in their approach. I mean, because we're adding to the meaning. And then I have to put it, I have a denotation, a definition, a connotation. Oh, remember we read about that Benjamin Banneker guy? How about Rosa Parks? I think she's an activist too, right? And who else have we read? What do you think about Einstein? And so on, okay? And listen, I know someone in my family who's an activist. Let me tell you what they did. All right. And that semantic category, it's a person who, it's a noun, all right? The syntactic category and so on. Okay. So why is this important? It's important because this facilitates precision of meaning. This facilitates access. It facilitates the ability to articulate one's understanding, of flexibility, all right? And so when we want students to be able to use words precisely, both expressively for speaking and for writing, then we have to be certain they have a depth of understanding. Okay, so how do we go about developing all this stuff? What do we do? So here is a chart in which I've represented my learning, my reading, from different sources having to do with vocabulary instruction. So whether you're reading people like Michael Graves or Andy B. Miller or Isabel Beck, right? All these folks who do wonderful, wonderful work in the area of vocabulary, what you find is they basically say the same thing about approaches to vocabulary instruction. They say it in somewhat different ways. This is the way I've taken their words and interpreted them. One, you directly, explicitly teach words. So that's the first one, and that's the one we're going to focus on. I call it intentional instruction. Okay. Two, you incidentally on purpose instruct, indirect instruction. Three, you intentionally teach kids word learning strategies. And four, down below, you develop word consciousness. You get them interested in words. You get them excited about learning words, right? So when you look at this, you can begin to think about your own instruction. Now, I can't talk to you about every one of those columns, or the fourth one, these 4 pillars of vocabulary instruction. So I'm going to focus on the first column, right? I'm going to focus on talking to you about how do you choose words? And what should an instructional routine look like? What does yours look like? You'll be thinking about, I do that. Or maybe I could add that. And how about processing and practice activities? Because if you're going for depth, it can't be a one-time deal. You've got to keep working at these words. Okay. Very briefly, second column, incidental on purpose. Structured point of contact. How many of you, when you've been reading something to your students, or when they get to a particular point in text, you give them a synonym or a substitution for the word? Haven't you done that? You know it's a word they don't know, so you just quickly give them a definition, a meaning. That's point of contact teaching. Stephen Stahl talks about that, okay, or did talk about that, right? And that's not meant to interrupt the flow. It's pretty quick. You know it's a word that they're going to need to be able to understand the text, but you've already chosen the words you're going to use, all right? You may have chosen this one ahead of time. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay. Structured teacher-student talk. It's really important to think about the nature of the conversations that you have with your students. You need to use academic language. You need to use the language of learning, the language that you're talking with your students about when you have conversations with them. And you need to set up times to have individual conversations, small group or group conversations in which students have varied opportunities to respond and use the words that relate to their learning. Structured shared reading, many of you do read alouds, I'm sure, right? And then structured independent reading. And I don't mean taking time, drop everything and read. I mean the reading that your students are doing on their own, and you give them some questions to answer, general questions, so they have a purpose for the reading. Maybe one of the questions is, come back with a word you're excited about and you want your classmates to learn about. Okay. And then when we move over, last one, you directly teach kids how to use the dictionary. You directly teach them how to use context clues. Not all contexts are created equal. Sometimes we say use the context, and there is no context to use, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then you teach them to use morphemic analysis. You teach them morphemes. And that goes along with your advanced word study. So we don't just teach kids basic phonics, we want to teach them advanced word study as well. So here's some questions to ask yourself. Ready? How do you choose words for direct, intentional, on purpose, and indirect, incidental, on purpose vocabulary instruction? Now maybe your curriculum tells you which words to teach. Maybe your books tell you which words to teach. I'd probably take another look at those words and make sure that those are the right words to teach. All right, I'm not saying they aren't important, but I might bring an eye to that with criteria in mind. Do you have a consistent routine for introducing words? What does it sound like if I visited your setting, public, private, clinic? If I listen to you introduce a word, what does it sound like? Does it align with the evidence? And then what activities do you use then and afterwards to get your kids to process and practice the meaning of those words? Because remember, those are the words you've decided you really, really want them to know, that you want them to own. Okay, so here comes the criteria. And this, for those of you who know Isabel Beck, right, this is going to look a little like Isabel Beck. It's not exactly her criteria, but similar. Well, I'm going to go through my text. I'm going to go through my Benjamin Banneker, or my Stalin, A Brutal Legacy, or my Animal Farm, or my Tuck Everlasting. And I'm going to make some decisions about, which words are the most useful and important that provide accessibility to the text? Words that might be encountered in other texts that have enduring importance. And then I'm going to ask, wow, do my kiddos really need to understand this word to understand the text? To get at the varied levels of understanding? And then, does the word have some possibilities in terms of growth? A morphological family, for instance, or a semantic family, semantic relatives. Remember, kids don't store words individually, they store them in networks. They store them with related words. You know that when you use like visual thesaurus and so on, you see all those networks pop up, right? There's a reason, that's the way we actually store words, okay? And how about multiple meanings? So I've labeled this, choosing words as a fuzzy problem space. I don't remember where I got that quote from, I wish I did, because there's no perfect way to choose the words, but there are general guidelines that you can use, right? And these represent one set of general guidelines. So here's what I did with Benjamin Banneker, to give you an example. I don't believe in wasting time when I preview a text. So not only did I go through and use the criteria to identify intentional instruction, I picked out a few words for incidental on purpose that I was going to use point of contact for. And then I also looked to see, are there some opportunities for me to teach a morpheme, or to have students apply their knowledge of morpheme, right? Or to use a context clue, or teach them how to use a context clue. So I'm going to be very purposeful, so that as we work our way through the text, yeah, I'm going to intentionally teach those words, but I'm on alert for some other opportunities for my kiddos. Okay. So those are the words I chose. Now you might choose different words, but those words look to me like they were pretty important, and there's probably going to be a few more. Activist, oh, big surprise, because remember, this is the revolutionaries' critical topic. Survey, that has multiple meanings, all right? Injustice, all right? And you know what? I'm not sure that word is even in the text, but sometimes we choose words that are related, all right, that directly connect to the big idea. Courageous, he certainly was, and just in case, revolutionaries, right? And obviously, point of contact, I thought it might be good to be able to just provide a synonym for grueling and a synonym for hypocrite, you know? I wasn't sure I wanted to teach those words directly, wasn't sure how often my kiddos would have to use those words. More breadth, you know, kind of thing. And then for context, almanac, yeah, because there's a direct description of almanac in this book, and determine, and then look at morphology. Well, I think we all know what DIC or DICT means, to say, right? To say before, to predict. And if we haven't taught our students that morpheme, I would, because that's a really useful one. Okay, so I'm going to give you an assignment now, all right? And here's your assignment. You need to go to your reading, and it's The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy. And because of time, I'm not going to ask you to read the whole thing, but I'm going to ask you to read the first 2 paragraphs, and I want you to select, all right, I selected ancient, but I want you to select a word that you think would be useful, would be important, and has potential for growth. If you were reading this with your students, choose one word that you think you would want to directly teach, okay? Everyone doing that individually. All right, so when you choose words, you can use the criteria that I just gave you, but I'm going to keep referencing this. This is one of those instructional roadmaps that tells you there's other ways of doing this, all right? So if you look at the very first column, word choice can be based on usefulness, growth, and understanding. That's what you just did. You might take your words off lists. There are lots of lists out there. So I want you to be aware of that. Remember, I said we could be flexible here, all right? Or you might use Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 words from Beck's work, if you happen to be familiar with that, okay? Well, the next thing you have to do after you've chosen your words is you have to come up with a definition, all right? Now, I know we're all going to run to our dictionaries and our thesauruses and so on, but you have to put it in your own words, and it really should follow some kind of a format. So I'm going to propose that we use, what you see in the next column, a word map. Now, there's lots of ways to define words. Eventually, you can get to 4 squares and you can get to dimensions. But let's go simple here, and let's just use a word map. So if you chose a noun, here's a word map for a noun. Who or what is it? So that's that category, right? So an activist is a person, for instance. Who or what is it like? What are some of the features, right? So an activist is someone who does something, who advocates for something, who takes a stand. You know, I could go on and on and on with the features, okay? So I also want to include that in the definition. In addition to providing the definition, you ought to give them a context. So I'm going to go right to the text, and I'm going to pull out examples, all right? Or if I know of something similar, I'm going to use that context to explain. So there's the example using activist, all right? So I need definitional and contextual information. How do I know that? Because the research told me that. When I teach a student a word, I provide a definition and I provide a context, okay? So an activist, a person who advocates or takes action for a cause. And then here's some examples. Now, these are not the exact words that are in Benjamin Banneker, but they're examples of what he did. So what did he do? He spoke out against racism before civil rights became a movement. He was a pretty brave guy, let me tell you. If you don't know about Benjamin Banneker, all right, he wrote an almanac, he helped survey Washington, he wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson about slavery. Can you imagine? Okay. He spoke out against what he thought was wrong, and he wrote to Jefferson about injustices of slavery. So that's a noun map, right? If I were doing an adjective, and most frequently we're picking nouns or adjectives, that's usually what happens, all right? We talk about what it describes, like, you know, if we're talking about being brutal, that would be like a characteristic of a person, a way in which a person acts, right? We could talk about some synonyms. Cruel, for instance, might be a synonym. And then we could take some examples of why Stalin, I'm referencing Stalin here, he was brutal, why he was brutal. Okay, so you get the sense of how you can use a word map. We could do something like this for verbs as well. So basically what you try to do is if it's a noun, you put it in a category, you talk about features, If it's a verb, an adjective, an adverb, generally what you're doing is talking about, its description, its action, type of action, like a category, and then you're doing some characteristics or features of it and providing some examples. So guess what I'm going to ask you to do right now? Do a quick word map of your word that you just chose. Because I'm going to have you share the definition with someone shortly. Okay. So do a quick word map. You can use the noun map, you can use the adjective map, or adapt it for a verb if you chose a verb. All right. So the first thing that we are doing here is developing the first part of an instructional routine for vocabulary instruction. And we're following what? Evidence-based principles. So when we think about what the evidence tells us, we need to choose our words, and we can use different criteria, but we used usefulness, growth, understanding, right? And then we have to think about providing definitional and contextual information. And we can provide definitional information by using word maps, or some of you might use four squares, some of you probably throw in visuals, flexibility, right? Okay. But we also have to provide contextual information. And yes, you can ask your students what it means, and that's fine for them to make that connection. But if you want them to understand the text, you probably should start with the context in which it's used in the text and make a connection there. And then you can go on and ask them for some additional information about what it might mean to them or their connection within their life. So now let's look at instructional routine, which just focuses on this first part. All right? The words have been chosen. We're going to use definitional and contextual information. And here's the routine. Doesn't take very long when we introduce a word this way, but it covers a lot of bases. Remember I said to you that if you really want your students to own a word, they have to know a lot about it. So part of the multi-dimension, or the depths of dimensionality, include understanding the phonology, the orthography, and the meaning. So guess what this routine begins with now? You can shift this a little bit. You'll see different variations on this. This is not like, I had a brainstorm and came up with something totally new. I'm always reading what others are doing, right? So this starts by asking your students not to see the word, but to listen to it. Yeah. So if I were using the word courageous, I'd say, listen to this word courageous. And I can discuss the structure now, or I can have you repeat it. Why don't you all repeat it? Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Courageous.
Let's think a little bit about that word courageous. Now, I'm beyond talking about the sounds, perhaps, but I would want to know, how many syllables did you hear in courageous? All right? Do you hear a suffix in courageous? I haven't even looked at that word yet. Do you think you might know what the base word is in courageous? We could start having that conversation. We'll talk about the spelling in a minute, but courageous. And then I can move on and I can say, here's what courageous means, right? Courageous is a characteristic. It's a trait that someone has. It has everything to do with being really, really brave, particularly when something is very difficult or scary. So, you thinking about how I can explain this in terms of a description, what it relates to, a category I can put it into, a feeling, I feel very courageous when, right? And then thinking about having done the definitional piece based off a word map or one that you've created, all right? Then thinking about what's the context. Benjamin Banneker was very courageous. Rosa Parks, can you imagine getting on a bus and sitting in a seat that you weren't supposed to sit in and what was going to happen after that? Can you imagine writing to Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who said all men are created equal, but he had slaves? Can you imagine? Courageous. So using the context. Okay. And then moving on, all right, and saying, has there been a time in your life when you were courageous? Who do you know that's courageous? So first the context from the text, and then the connection. And then writing it up on the board, writing it on the smart board, writing it on, your chart paper. Right? Now look at this word. Listen as I write this word. Listen as I spell this word. Let's see if there's anything that's a little tricky about this word. So the word is courageous. I see courage. And then I see this ending, don't I? O-U-S. And so it's C-O-U-R-A-G-E, us, O-U-S. Anything a little tricky in here, and we could talk about this sound, right? That's a little tricky. Courageous. All right. And then having students record it. And whether it's index cards, whether it's word journals, using pictures. Some of your kids really need pictures. Sometimes you add gestures to this, depending upon the word. There's different ways you can elaborate on this. All right, your turn, all right? You have a word. There's the routine. The routine's in your participant guide as well, all right? I want you to take just a moment, prepare your word, right? And then partner up, right? And if you're a triad, that's fine, okay? Partner up or work in a triad and teach each other your word. And let's do this in like 1 minute or less, each of you, because our time is limited. But I'll give you a minute to get ready. So it's a get ready minute. Think about the routine, read through it, and then get ready to do it with a partner. If you're done, put your hand up. Okay. I want to stop anybody who's still working. Okay. All right. How did that feel? How did that feel? Did it feel familiar? Yes? No? Was there something new or different about that? Yeah. Okay. So again, when you read the literature, this is very similar to lots of routines that are out there. I've just tweaked it a little bit. You could tweak it a little bit as well. What I want you to keep in mind is make the connections between the phonology. I could also say morphology there, couldn't I? Between that, the orthography, and then the meaning. All right. And so often when I've been in classrooms, what I've seen teachers do is they immediately go to the connection the student can make. All right. I think you have to build the connections within the text first. They may not be able to make their own connections initially. Again, this happens over time. So the other part of this instructional routine is really to give them more practice, because this is just the beginning, right? This is just the introduction of the word. So what we want to do is give them multiple exposures, because you're teaching for depth. And maybe it'll go beyond the reading of the text, or if you're reading texts that are aligned in terms of critical understandings, you'll have opportunity to work with these words again. So you want multiple exposures, you want engagement for deep processing, right? And you want multiple activities before, during, and after reading. So I kind of grouped these processing and practice activities in this way. I grouped them into making connections, relationships with other words. So that's really building semantic relationships, thinking about how the words are related to other similar words, words that, for instance, belong in their family. Synonyms, antonyms, right? Words that you might find in the network. So we can use semantic maps. Lots of you do mapping with your kids. We can use concept maps. We can use something called semantic gradient analysis, and that involves usually antonyms and synonyms. If you're very, very courageous, what word might you use? If you're just a little courageous, what word might you use? What's the opposite of being courageous? Right? If you're a little scared, what word would you use? If you're very scared, what word would you use? Yeah. So preciseness. Representations. Here's your pictures, here's your drawings. Your videos, some of those vocab videos that you see kids produce are absolutely phenomenal. They're wonderful. Kids get to act out the words, right? Gestures and movement, right? Oftentimes we can think of a gesture or a movement that goes along with the word. At AIM Academy, where I have worked in the past, there's a course that kids take. It's called Interactive Humanities, and it's called Club. But each year they study a different period in history, and they actually enter into that period in history. So first graders go to Cave Club, and the room looks like a cave. And they wear skins, not real ones. And there's plant and foliage around, and the walls are painted. But there's a password. It's a vocabulary word to get into the club, right? And there's usually a gesture that goes with it. So just thinking about this in different ways, having students connect, and then use. Questions and examples. You know, Isabel Beck's work is really wonderful in terms of that. We'll see an example in a minute. Asking kids questions about the words. When were you courageous? When's the last time you saw something ancient? And if they say their nana or grandma, not so good. My grandchildren would say that. Conversation prompts. For those of you working with older students, Socratic circles, academic conversations. And then writing stems, getting them to write about what they're learning about. I remember walking into a classroom a number of years ago, and teachers saying to me, "This is what we're writing about," and they were so excited. And I thought, well, those are interesting things. You know, the basketball team that was the winning basketball team, or their hero, you know, on a basketball or football or baseball team. Those are wonderful things. But I said to them, don't you think you should be writing about what they're learning about? I mean, writing this direct connection. Okay. So everything in the darker blue has to do with what I just talked about, processing and practicing. Remember, I keep using the word flexibility. These are different examples of things that we can do in order to move beyond definitional and contextual information, right? And to give students opportunities to practice. So there's the semantic relationships. You see an example of a semantic map. You see the grading, the scaling, good to bad. What's in between, what's outside? Okay. Sometimes you have to put those words on Post-its and have them arranged. And then attributes. What does it look like, sound like, feel like, smell like? Okay. And then pictures or drawings, right? So there's a little drawing there of a little Revolutionary War figure, all right? Actually a figure from the reading of the founding of an American democracy. Vocab videos, and then word walls. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Parts of speech word walls. Taking your vocabulary words, putting them up and arranging them by parts of speech. And then speaking or listening, writing stems, using your words, examples, questions, connections, and then some other approaches that you see, particularly for older students. Some of you may know the work of Jeff Schweiers and others with academic conversations. But, you know, giving students opportunity to talk, but weaving in, saying, we're going to use these words today. All right. So there's an example of shades of meaning. Sometimes I've seen teachers bring in, you know, the color strips that you get from paint stores or from Lowe's, yeah. And so we've got different shades of meaning here. Someone's courageous, they're bold, they're spirited. Yeah, okay. Nuance, right? Just as the colors are nuanced. And then we could scale cowardly to courageous. Here's a word wall. This is a parts of speech word wall, all right? Notice the descriptions for the nouns. We're going to go into sentence comprehension shortly. Who or what, is or was doing, which one, what kind, how many, all right? When, why, how. Those are the questions that those parts of speech answer, all right? And then doing the sorting, or building that wall, okay? All right. And then the speaking, if I say something that could be described as courageous, then raise your hand. And giving an example, for instance, either from text or life. Right? And this is really Isabel Beck's work. Applaud how much you would want to feel assertive or timid, opposites of courageous. Okay. Describe a time when you had to be courageous. Why would someone have to be assertive? When I feel assertive, I feel. And then how are these words related? Abolish, assertive, courageous. By the way, all these words reference back to dear Benjamin Banneker and to that critical understanding. So the words are related throughout. And you're building, it's incremental, you're building on their understanding of them. Okay. So the last two I've already briefly described to you. We're not going into these in detail today. The focus for us was on how do you choose words? What do your principles of instruction look like? And they're based off of our understanding we want to teach words for depth, therefore, definitional and contextual information, lots and lots of opportunity, and then a routine that aligns with that. Processing and practice activities. All right. Okay. So, just an example from Incidental on Purpose. Good vocabulary teaching involves a lot of talk and practice using language. Bring your advanced language into the classroom. Do not talk to your students in basic Tier 1 words. Use Tier 2, Tier 3 words. Use more advanced language with your students. And they'll start to use the same language. You'll hear them talking academic language. All right? That's Noni Lasso. And she does a lot of work. She's at Harvard with knowledge building and ELL students. What does the talking, should say, sound like in your classroom? And then academic conversations and Socratic circles. You know, a lot of our teacher talk has to do with the routines of the classroom. Hand this in, that goes over there, line up now, right? That's not teaching them any vocabulary, though. That's important for your classroom routines. You have to start thinking about perhaps even, as Emerald would say, kicking that language up a notch. Okay. And then this is just another chart. I've included a lot of infographics and charts for you with instructional techniques. This comes out of Bauman and colleagues' work, a lot of work with middle school students. In terms of, you know, when you ask kids to use context, you have to be really careful about whether or not the context is meaningful. So here's some things you can teach that will allow for students to use context. Then you have to find examples within the text that align with it. So sometimes the text will provide a definition, sometimes it will provide a synonym, an antonym, an example, or sometimes there'll just be some general statements. But keep in mind, not all contexts are created equal. So I just chose one from Benjamin Banneker so you get a sense of, if I were working with students, I'd say, you know, I can find an example in Benjamin Banneker for using the context for that word almanac. And if we look carefully, the author actually gives us a definition. So here's the first sentence. There were many white scientists who taught themselves astronomy in Benjamin's day and published their own almanac. Well, you kind of get the sense published is, that's your first clue, it's going to be a book, right? But what kind of a book? Oh, folks read the almanac to find out when the sun would rise and set, when eclipses would occur, and how the weather would change from season to season. So now I've got a clue as to what I might find in an almanac. By the way, farmers might find that pretty interesting, right? Okay. All right, so there it is. Again, something for you to take away, to think about. You might want to add some things to this, right? You can't use all of it. It's just some examples of what we know are evidence-based routines, strategies, and activities. And by the way, to develop breadth, a lot of those activities to the right can help develop breadth as well.